know the Slender Man meme? It reminds me of a story my great-grandmother used to tell me about a monster named Long Jack. I know Slender Man was just a meme started on something awful, and it spawned all sorts of stories and pics and gags, Slender Man porn. But certain images and aspects of the story remind me of that old ghost story. So here it is. I should caution that I didn't actually hear the story myself firsthand. When I was little, we lived a while at my grandmother's house while my parents were getting divorced. And my grandmother lived just down the road in a cottage, and the power would reliably go out during big winter storms in those days, and great-grandma, we called her Tiny Grandma, she was really Yoda-ish, but she would come over, and we'd all sit in front of the fire and wait it out. The old folks would tell stories and read books. I was only 4 or 5, so Tiny Grandma would tell the story of Long Jack after I fell asleep. My older brother and cousins would tell it to me later. Now, Tiny Grandma and the rest of us lived in the Pacific Northwest, way out in the boonies, actually. She herself was an infant when her parents brought her out west. They were homesteaders. There's an old photograph of her as a child standing in front of a one-room log schoolhouse. There are huge old-growth trees behind her, lots of dark shadows. It's still very gloomy in the winter months in the PNW, even though the trees are much thinner these days. Long Jack, whatever he was originally a person. I don't know his real name. In that time in history, families lived by themselves in the woods, miles and hours of travel away from each other. But there were also a lot of people coming and going. Other homesteaders, people looking for logging jobs, prospectors on their way to the Fraser Canyon Gold Rush, Klondike Gold Rush, whatever. There weren't hotels except for in the big cities. When you slept, it was either in your own camp or some courteous homesteader would let you sleep in their house or barn. Maybe violent criminals wasn't a big issue back then. Maybe people were more naive. But the guy who would become Long Jack was a murderer. There had been a great string of murders in the region. Whole families were slaughtered. Sometimes Indians would be blamed. There were still some isolated Indian wars going on. But it didn't really look like that. It looked like people were inviting somebody in. And he ended up murdering them in their sleep. Obviously, detective work wasn't big back then. And in any case, sometimes it would be weeks or months before they discovered the bodies, and the killer would be long gone. Now, I don't know if this one guy, Long Jack, whatever his name was, killed all of them. But he did kill at least one family, and he was caught, literally, red-handed, near the town of Bellingham, near where my family is from. They used to lynch people in those days. Usually it was black people. In the PNW, where there weren't a lot of black people, it was more often Chinese men or Eastern European men, but occasionally they lynched white men, even though they had a proper court system at the time. Still, it was risky to do, and the vigilantes did risk some blowback, especially for lynching white men. So the local sheriff, John Larrabee, took the murderer out of his cell at night and took him out of town, with a posse, to some cliffs a couple of miles outside the south of town, and they built a primitive gallows with an extra long rope, with the intent to hang him off the cliff extra high. Well, the hangman that day was a local eccentric by the name of Dan Harris. Well, they picked him because he was a retired soldier and knew everything there was to know about ropes and knots. He volunteered for the job because, as a soldier, he had specifically been a whaler, and had a morbid fascination with flesh and how to disassemble and render it. If the posse had known that, they probably wouldn't have taken him on for the job. Dan Harris didn't just put a noose around the condemned man's neck. He put small nooses made of cord around each of his fingers, and at the end of each of the cords was a heavy lead weight. Around each wrist was a length of rope with a heavy stone, and at each ankle was a rope attached to even heavier stones. And the posse watched Harris do all this, but they did not know what he was doing, and even Larrabee didn't have the foresight to object. It came time to hang the man, and somebody in the posse finally pushed, well, probably Larrabee, and the man fell quickly to his doom. The posse expected to hear the sharp crack of a breaking neck, and all they heard was the sound of counting. In Harris's low voice, he had tied the noose to strangle, not break. 1, 2, 3, 4. They heard a loud crack, almost like a shot. 7, 8, 9, 10. But then they heard another. It wasn't the man's neck, but his legs, dislocating from his hip. 14, 15, 16. They heard more pops and cracks, his shoulders dislocating, his elbows, his ankles. 21, 22, 23. Then his fingers dislocated at each knuckle, sounding a bit like popcorn. Choking grunts could still be heard coming from the man, but he was still alive and conscious through all of this. 36, 37, 38. Harris's voice became louder, and his audience became more enraptured in the spectacle. When he came to 43, it was the loudest crack of all. The makeshift goblet broke, and the murder, and all the weights and rope went tumbling down the cliff face, his neck and limbs all twisting and flailing in impossible angles. In the darkness they could barely make out his corpse at the bottom. It was a horror. His limbs had all been stretched to awful, fantastical lengths, all intertwined with the ropes and each other. It was too dark to retrieve the body, and by the next day, animals had gotten to it and carried it away. And this is where my great-grandmother comes in. They used to tell her that the ghost of Long Jack haunted those woods, abducting defenseless people if they traveled those woods. They said he would count as he stepped up behind you. 1, 2, 3, 4. She heard him once, as she walked the long distance home from school one fall afternoon. 14, 15, 16. According to the story, you couldn't look back or he'd get you. You had to run as fast as you could, and ran she did. 21, 22, 23. The counting continued. It was like he was whispering, but it was still getting louder, and it seemed he was right behind her. 27, 28. She could hear his footfalls. His pace was much longer than hers, longer than any adult's. She could tell from the rhythm that his legs were impossibly long. His arms and legs must be bending in some unnatural position. She got to the door of their cabin. 37, 38, and slammed the door shut. Silence. She knew that if Long Jack had gotten to 43, that she would have been killed. There were other kids that got lost in the woods those days. They were never found. None of the adults ever mentioned Long Jack, but she had her thoughts to herself. So that's the story of Long Jack, as my great-grandmother told it, or at least as my brother and cousins retold it. I don't believe in ghosts myself, but I always did like the story. I haven't found any mention of such a murderer in the local archives, but then again, I wouldn't really expect to. Some of the other historic names, though, that actually does check out. 39, 40, 41,